To the officers for a very active fall semester here with lots of great speakers. I think you're the final speaker in a good lineup of virtual talks. So thank you to them for their efforts, and thanks for agreeing to come and speak to us. Dr. Gandhi is an assistant professor in the Department of Mathematics and Applied Mathematics at Virginia Commonwealth. And his background, his interest is in pattern formation of complex systems. At one time, as a graduate student, I studied under Dr. Patrick Shipman, who is an expert in this area, and we studied pattern formation of surfaces undergoing ion bombardment. So this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say about the applications to ecosystems and pattern formation in this context. So whenever you're ready, thank you again.
All right, well, thank you very much. And thanks to the SIAM chapter for inviting me. I'm very excited to talk to you a little bit about some of the work I've been doing. I'm going to go ahead and share a link in the chat before I get started. This link is will take you to the Google Maps of the region that I'm showing here on this introductory slide. And so I want to give you all a minute to just kind of click on it, zoom in, zoom out, and get a feel for what we're looking at. And as you're doing that, maybe I'll start to introduce what I'm going to talk about today. And so I'm going to tell you about these dryland vegetation patterns. And so from the link, you can tell that this is this region, it's a satellite image near the border of Ethiopia and Somalia. I like to start out by showing you this kind of like large scale view of things where you can kind of see the whole landscape where these patterns appear. And a few things that I want to point out about it is that you can kind of notice that there are these channel-like structures on the landscape, sort of as a large scale structure of what we're looking at. And then within these structures, you can kind of see there's alternating dark and light pattern there. And so this is an example of the vegetation patterns that I'm going to be talking about. The dark regions there are relatively densely packed vegetation, and the light regions are mostly bare soil. Okay, and so in these regions, these very dry regions, we've observed that these very strikingly regular patterns can appear of alternating dense vegetation and bare soil. And you can kind of zoom in and look at the scales. And I'm going to go to the next slide. Oh, can I go to the next slide? There we go. If you zoom into some section of this, you can kind of get a closer look at the pattern itself. And so on the right here is a recent satellite image of that region. And on the left is actually an aerial photograph taken by the British Royal Air Force when they were surveying the area, back around, I guess, in 1945. And this was really the first time that people had noticed these patterns. And the reason is because you can see that, the spacing of these vegetation bands is kind of on the order of 100 meters. So from the ground, they're kind of hard to observe. So you really need to be up high to see these things. And comparing between these two images, the other thing you might notice is that these patterns are relatively robust and long-lived, right? You can kind of see there's not much change in going from one to the other. And then another thing I want to point out is that where these patterns appear are pretty flat. The terrain is very flat, but there is tends to be a slight elevation grade. And so in this image, there's this downward pointing arrow pointing downhill. And the vegetation bands that we're looking at and this is kind of a general observation, is that they tend to be aligned transverse to that downhill direction. And in this case, you can kind of notice that they're arced a little bit. They're not straight, and they tend to be arced, in this case at least, so that they're convex upslope, okay? And so these are some kind of observations about this. And as I said, this is like relatively flat terrain. We're talking about like 0.5% grade is the overall elevation change across this terrain. And you can see this blue line up here, just to give you some sense. This blue line is 0.5% elevation grade to scale. So this is, we're talking very slight elevation grades. And so on the, standing on the surface, you might not notice it, but it's enough to influence water flow. And that's really the key aspect of that, of the topography and influencing these patterns. Okay, and so while I said there's been, you know, relatively little change going over this, you know, what is it, 60, you know, 70 some odd years, but there have been some changes. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just flip back and forth between these two images, and I want you to try to see if you can notice any changes in going back and forth between these two images. So here's the early black and white photograph, and here's the satellite image. And I'm just going to flip back and forth a little. And so hopefully you've noticed some changes, and what really jumps out at me is that if going from this earlier photo to the later satellite image, if you kind of track one of these vegetation bands, they tend to have moved, and generally they've moved in an uphill direction. And so that's a feature that's been observed at these vegetation patterns sites, is that the bands tend to migrate uphill. And of course, it's not like the vegetation is getting up and moving. What's happening is water is flowing from these bare regions and getting infiltrated at the leading edge of these vegetation bands. So it makes the leading edge of the vegetation band more able to grow. So it's better growing conditions at the leading edge, and because more of the water from this uphill region gets deposited down at the top, the trailing edge sort of has worse growing conditions, and so it tends to die. And so we have this kind of slow migration. Let's go ahead. And so here's an example where people have tried to quantify this. And so this is a small region where we're looking at these vegetation bands, and this arrow is pointing downhill. And so here are, you know, between 1967 and 2006, and this is the difference map, where the red is where vegetation has been lost in going from this image to this image, and the green is where it's been added. Okay, and so the black is where their vegetation is in both places. And so we can kind of see there is this measurable shift uphill of the vegetation bands. And so they've done this at several vegetation band sites, and they've noticed typical speeds around tens of centimeters per year. So this is really slow, and given the scale of these vegetation bands, it might take something like centuries in order for the band to migrate one full band spacing, so one full wavelength of this pattern. So this is a really slow evolution, but it is measurable. Okay, and so that's kind of just a really brief introduction into what I'm going to be talking about, these dryland vegetation patterns. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you a little bit more background into the patterns and how we can model them. And then I'll talk to you about some main results. And really the underlying idea of I want to get across to you all is that whenever we see a system like this that supports patterns, you know, this spontaneous formation of patterns, that we can use those patterns to learn something about the system that supports it. Okay, and so that's kind of the main thrust here is now, given that we have these patterns, how can we use them to learn about that ecosystem that supports them? And then if there's time, I'll talk a little bit more about some next steps that I've been working on with collaborators. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, so as I said, these are dryland vegetation patterns in that they occur in drylands, and drylands are defined by a lack of water or water deficit. And so these ecosystems are really controlled by water availability, and they cover something like 40% of the land on Earth, and they're home to something like a third of the population. So they're really important for people to study. And it actually gets worse than just there being limited water. In a lot of these places, the water comes in kind of really infrequently and sometimes unpredictably. And so this is rainfall data near the region where I showed you at the beginning. And you can kind of make out there's maybe a couple of, there's about 2 rainy seasons per year in this region, but the amount of rainfall that comes in these rainy seasons really fluctuates, and there's sometimes where you have huge storms that appear almost, in between rainy seasons. So this is given the changing climates, the study of these ecosystems is important, and so it would be nice to be able to understand something about these ecosystems and their resilience. And so that's kind of one of the main long-term goals of looking at these patterns. Okay, and so a little bit more when we're talking about drylands, as I said, they're characterized by a deficit of water, and we can measure this in terms of something called the aridity index. And so this is the mean annual precipitation divided by the potential evapotranspiration. So what we're doing is we're getting how much water is coming into the system divided by how much water it could use if it had enough, if it had all the water available to it. And so in the regions where these vegetation patterns come in, that ratio is something between 1/2 and 1/20th. And so that they appear in these arid and semi-arid regions. And so these plants are really kind of water stressed, right? They're not getting as much water as they would like. And so and the other thing to note is that they do appear really everywhere. And so in this map down here, we have these black spots where they have been identified, where vegetation patterns have been identified in the literature, and you can really see that they fall really strongly within these kind of red and orange lines, orange colors, which correspond to climates classified as arid and semi-arid. So this is really kind of the strongest determining factor in where these vegetation patterns appear is water availability. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on banded vegetation patterns, but I just want to point out that there are other types of patterns that have been observed. So you can have patches of vegetation in a bare soil background. You can have gaps of vegetation in an otherwise uniform vegetation background. And you could also have these kind of labyrinthian type patterns. So the other patterns typically appear whenever the elevation is very flat, so less than 0.2% grade overall. And then once we start to see over 2.2% grade, we start to see these bands appearing. Okay. And so in terms of modeling, the approach I'm going to focus on is really trying to do qualitative modeling or conceptual modeling, where we're not really interested in capturing a lot of fine details. We just really want to get a qualitative picture of what's happening, and some idea about trends, and so we're not trying to make any very detailed predictions here. We just want to get some conceptual understanding of underlying mechanisms, and so to that end, the level of modeling I'm going to talk to you about is really aimed at capturing this basic phenomenon that we see these patterns in sort of intermediate level of water availability. So if there's too little water available, we tend to see bare soil, just barren desert. And if there's a lot of water available, or I should say enough water available, the vegetation tends to appear uniformly across the domain, okay? And so it's just really in this kind of intermediate region where we see these patterns, okay? And so as I've emphasized, water and water availability is really important for these patterns. And so the modeling framework tries to capture that by modeling interactions between water and biomass. And these are in quotes because this is really, again, very conceptual idea of water and biomass. So we're not going to try to capture these details, capture details of these processes in a lot of detail, but what we're going to consider is for water, we're going to have water coming in through precipitation. It's going to be lost through evaporation and transpiration of the plants, and then it can be transported. And typically we think of this transport as happening along the surface of the water before it gets infiltrated into the ground. But that's like additional detail that we're not going to consider here. And then in terms of biomass, biomass, the plants can grow, they can die, and then they can sort of spread out through seed dispersal or replication or some other process like that. So this is kind of the general framework we're going to use with these, kind of conceptual ideas for biomass and water. And the underlying mathematical mechanism for pattern formation is really, has appeared in a lot of different contexts in terms of the models, and it's typically summed up by this idea of short range cooperation and long range competition, and so this is first I think first developed by Alan Turing and sort of expanded on throughout the years, but this sort of basic idea of different length scales in terms of the interactions allows for the patterns to form in a lot of systems, and this is no different. Okay, and in terms of specifics, models tend to capture different mechanisms for this type of interaction, and in the model that I've just described to you, probably you can think of physically what's happening in terms of these different length scales of interaction is that the water can flow along the surface. And so in that sense, there's competition for the water between the plants in order to get the plants to in order to get the water to come to them. But then if you're next to like plants that are close together, once they've attracted the water, it's sort of like useful for all of the plants around them. Okay, so that's kind of the conceptual idea of the main mechanism here. Okay, and so to get into more details of really the simplest model of this form, and again, we're going to have these two fields, and we're going to consider the dynamics as a pair of reaction-advection-diffusion equations. So the water field has these, terms in it. The dynamics are described by these processes. So precipitation, evaporation, transpiration, and transport. And in this model here, we're going to assume that the the pattern is appearing on a uniformly sloped hill. So that says that the water is getting advected downhill at a uniform speed. Okay, so in this model, this V is a constant. And then we have biomass, mortality, growth, and dispersal. And we're modeling the dispersal with linear diffusion, which is not a great model for seed dispersal, but again, it captures qualitatively what's happening. And one of the real drawbacks with these kind of really conceptual models is it's sometimes difficult to pin down parameters that really make sense, because the way you're modeling the processes don't really line up with what's happening. So there are some in terms of this type of model, there are some parameters which you can sort of pull out from data about the process that's being modeled. So, for example, water use efficiency and kind of carbon costs define these parameters here. But a lot of the other parameters are kind of chosen to fit with observation. And so things like evaporation rate, these kinds of things are like fit based on observations about typical water levels or biomass levels when we have uniform vegetation. And then the really tricky parameters here are when we're thinking about the transport, because when we think about water transport and kind of water overland water flow, we're thinking of these like really short, few hours rainstorms where the water is traveling very, very fast. And then that's it for, so most of the time the water is not really traveling very far, but there are these short periods where it's traveling really far. And we're modeling it, the transport is kind of an annually averaged slow march kind of downhill. And similarly, the precipitation, we're having this kind of slow drizzle of water coming on rear round instead of these pulses of rain. And so anyways, that leads to some difficulties with these transport terms. And so typically what people do is they choose the patterns, choose those parameters to fit to characteristics of the pattern, right? And that's a little like maybe dubious, because we want to model these patterns and we're kind of using these parameters to fit things. And so, but anyways, we it's still useful to do this. And it's hopefully you'll see as I keep going.
Quick
Yes.
question, Punit. You had mentioned that earlier that one parameter in these systems that's crucial in determining the types of patterns that you'll see is the change in elevation, or is the grade of the landscape in which the vegetation is occupying. I don't explicitly see this being modeled. Is that somehow wrapped up in V, the transport in the water term?
Yeah, so this model here was specifically for these banded patterns on a hill slope. What people have done are generalizations of this model or extensions of these model to capture those other patterns. And what they do is they add a diffusion term in the water. And then this V sort of characterizes the slope of the hill. And whenever it gets small enough, you start to see transitions from banded patterns to these other types of patterns.
I see. So this model as written is not capable of supporting other types of patterns.
That's right. Yeah. So we're in this model, we're focusing exclusively on these banded patterns. But again, we can think about adding a diffusion term to the water, and that would allow us more flexibility.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good question. Yeah, that point is going to come up a little bit later. Okay, and then the other thing, in terms of the actual like underlying mechanisms, the nonlinear feedbacks that we think are important in the formation of these patterns. One of the most important ones is how biomass affects water flow. Okay, and so there's this infiltration feedback where in these desert regions, in these really dry regions, you have you tend to see this crust form on the surface on the surface, and it makes it hard for water to infiltrate down into the soil. But whenever we have plants there, they can kind of break up that soil and allow like increased porosity for the water to flow down into the soil. And so what we have is this biomass feedback on infiltration, where if there's no biomass, it's hard for the water to get into the soil. And if there is biomass, it's easier for the water to get into the soil. And so that's sort of heuristically captured in this model. Other models capture it more explicitly, but that's really kind of one of the more important mechanisms we think in allowing these patterns to form. Okay, so anyways, taking this model, we can non-dimensionalize it, and maybe I won't go through this. And in terms of analysis of this model, we're going to just focus on this model right here. I'm going to just right now focus on a one-dimensional domain. So we're thinking of a slice along the hill slope, and the bumps in biomass are corresponding to like transverse slices of these bands. Okay, and in that when we set things up like that, we can really kind of, instead of dealing with the full PDE system, we can actually reduce things to a system of ODEs that will describe the solutions to that PDE that we're interested in. And in particular, we're interested in traveling wave solutions because, as I mentioned to you, these bands are kind of migrating uphill. And so to do that, we can go into a co-moving frame with the bands, assume that speed is c, which we don't know, but we can make a transformation into that frame. And then we can assume that in that frame, the pattern is stationary, right? Because we're moving along with it. It's not changing. That's what a traveling wave is. And then we can reduce things to, we can rewrite things as a system of first order ODEs. So where this n is a derivative, second derivative of biomass, and that comes from this diffusion term here. And that allows us to kind of study this pattern formation process where we see this where we're thinking of it as an instability of a uniform state, which leads to this, traveling wave pattern of vegetation migrating uphill, as just a bifurcation that leads to an oscillatory state, okay, in a system of ODEs. And in particular, what we're looking for is a Hopf bifurcation of this uniform state, okay? So that's kind of underlying when we're dealing with one-dimensional patterns, how we can think about it and try to analyze things. And there's been a lot of work along this direction. And I'm not going to go through this, I guess, in too much detail, but maybe once we have this, we can use numerical continuation to, we can kind of do the linear stability analysis by hand pretty much. But when we want to kind of know what those nonlinear states are, what these traveling wave states look like, we need to kind of move to numerical methods and in particular numerical continuation. And so this is the resulting bifurcation diagram. What I'm showing here is this black state is the uniform vegetation state. And as you decrease water availability, that state loses stability. And again, in those system of ODEs, it's a Hopf bifurcation, but that corresponds to this traveling wave instability in the PDEs. And then we start to see a whole family of patterns form with different wavelengths, so different spacings between the bands. And they sort of coexist in this gray region here. And then there's one pattern that has a single wavelength on the domain, and that turns out to be the pattern that persists all the way down to the lowest precipitation value. And then below that, we see just bare soil existing. Okay, so that's the rough structure of this model. And yeah, so the thing is, when we're doing this continuation, we're kind of thinking about things as a function of this wave number and migration speed and precipitation. Okay, so that's okay. And then the last thing I want to point out in terms of these models is we're really focused on this kind of like conceptual side of things, where we're really using the simplest possible model to capture what we're looking at. But on the other extreme are these really detailed mechanistic models that try to capture, every single process in a way that's sort of like really detailed and capturing all the aspects of it. And so these kind of models, there's of course advantages and disadvantages to either one, but the main, I guess, thrust of the work that I'm talking to you about today is that we want to start with these conceptual models and kind of step towards adding more details by taking the smallest step possible where we can really get the most amount of knowledge out of that step. Okay, so that's kind of the underlying strategy of this work. Okay, and so that's kind of the background of the modeling in the vegetation patterns, and now we'll go on to the main results. And before we do that, I just want to acknowledge my collaborators on this work. And this started while I was a postdoc at the Mathematical Biosciences Institute, and so it's been really great to work with all these people. And I'll also say that Luke did a lot of the image analysis work. He sort of led the way in that image analysis work that I'm going to show before he started a PhD at Caltech. So, okay. So now that we've kind of gone through the modeling, I want to go back and focus on some early observations that people had when they were first noticing these vegetation patterns. And so in the first study, and I highlighted this early on, is that they noticed that these bands tend to be transverse to the elevation grade. And at least in the places where the first studies were looking at, they were arced so that they were convex upslope. Okay, and so this was the picture that people thought of with these vegetation bands. And then later on, people noticed that, well, that's not always the case. So in this picture here, they have, what we have is two ridges kind of aligned along a hill slope. And in the middle, we have a long, broad valley. And this is kind of hard to see from this case, but this was really where people first started to make conjectures like this, is that along the ridge here, they said, well, the arcs, oh, I'm sorry, I said this backwards. This is a long, broad ridge, and these are two valleys. Sorry, okay. So on these two valleys, the arcs tend to be convex upslope. And then in this long, broad ridge in between, they tend to have this general convex downslope trend to them, okay? And so this is a little bit hard to see, but people noticed in other places that actually, yes, these bands aren't always just arced in one direction. They tend to arc in kind of curved in all different ways. And people, these people making these observations conjectured that, well, these bands are really just following elevation contours. There's slight variation in the elevation, and we're seeing that in the shape of these bands, okay? And the other thing these people studying the patterns early on realized is, well, we really need to use mathematics to understand what's happening here. Like this is there's something that could be brought in by mathematics beyond what ecologists and other geologists might have to offer in understanding what's happening. And so, so I'll say, so this, these were first noticed in the 50s, and then eventually, almost 50 years later, mathematicians and physicists came along and tried to do some modeling. And what they did, what they noticed is that in the models they were producing, they could tend to get these arcs in the vegetation bands without having any kind of variation in the topography other than a uniform slope. Okay, so so this was appearing in kind of the first models, and then even people study this more in detail in later models. But this is the modelers sort of came to this realization, is that we don't need to really worry about variations in topography. We can just consider uniform hill slope, and we can still see this. And so that this observation wasn't really addressed in the modeling literature until my collaborators and I started thinking about this. And what we wanted to do first is to kind of go and see, this idea of a correlation between the underlying topography and the shape of these vegetation bands. Is there really a correlation there? And in order to do that, we went to this region here in Western Australia, virtually went to this region here in Western Australia. And we picked it because we saw that the bands really had these nice variations in curvature. And so we wanted to explore that in understanding what's happening relative to the topography. And the other nice thing about Australia is Australia maintains a digital elevation model that's sort of been corrected in a lot of ways and smoothed out from the raw data collected by NASA. So while it's not the highest resolution elevation data that we can get, it's pretty good, and it has a lot of nice features to it. And so we decided to look at Australia. Oh, wow. I'm just noticing the time. I guess I'm try to speed up a little bit. And what we noticed is, so Luke started looking at these images, and what he did is he based on the elevation, identified ridges and valleys. And in these ridges and valleys, he looked at the vegetation bands and their curvature to see if they were curved convex upslope or convex downslope, okay? And what he found was that consistent with these predictions about the bands arcing in the direction of the elevation contours, that when they were in the valleys, they were arced convex upslope, and when they were on the ridges, they were arced convex downslope. So this was consistent with that prediction, although there were some significant variations in, they didn't exactly follow the contours, but there were at least this general trend in the direction of the arcing. But the thing that he found that really surprised us was that the overwhelming majority of the bands appeared on ridges in this region in Australia. And this was the exact opposite of what we saw when we were looking in that region in the Horn of Africa, where I showed you initially. There we saw really almost all of the vegetation bands were appearing within these valleys, okay? And so that was kind of first realization that kind of helped us put our modeling results into context. Okay, and so in terms of the modeling, we started out again with this very simple reaction-advection-diffusion framework, which I sort of talked you through, but now we're dealing with these two-dimensional patterns. So instead of thinking about a one-dimensional domain, we're thinking about a two-dimensional domain. And so the main difference is this diffusion is now a two-dimensional linear diffusion. And then we took this model and added a little bit of detail to it in terms of the water transport, because that's where we expect the topography to influence things, right? In terms of how the water flows on the surface. So instead of having this uniform advection downhill, we said that the advection rate is proportional to the local elevation gradient, okay? And using product rule, we can kind of separate this into two pieces, which I think each of them has a nice physical intuition about them. So this piece right here is kind of the transport of the water down the elevation gradient. And then this piece right here, I like to think of as kind of an accumulation term. And you'll notice it's related to the curvature of the terrain, not the gradient. And so what's happening is, this is what allows you to distinguish if you're at the top of a ridge versus the bottom of a valley, right? If you're at the top of the ridge, the water gets diverted away. And so whereas if you're in a valley, the water accumulates there. And so that difference in curvature, the sign of the curvature, comes in here, okay? And so we can put it in, and kind of for bookkeeping reasons, I'm going to put this term over here and this term over here. And I'll point out that this is like a simplified version of what other people had done. And what was done here was actually including diffusion. So in generalizing things to have both advection and diffusion in the water transport was done here. And we've kind of simplified that to only include the advection piece. Okay, and so now we have a model, and now we want to kind of think about an idealized topography. And to do that, we sort of looked at general features of what we were seeing in the data, and we sort of came up with this idea that we have, generally we have like an elevation grade, and then we have some transverse variation in the elevation, so that we have like a series of ridges and valleys aligned roughly along the elevation grade. And so that's kind of the model topography we used. So you can kind of think of like a corrugated, metal roof or something. That's the image of what we were thinking about. And then we can run simulations of the model on this domain, and sure enough, with the model, so the black lines here are elevation contours, and I've actually taken in this picture the domain is from here to here, and I've just copied this region and did kind of a periodic extension, since I'm using periodic boundary conditions, just so we can kind of see what's happening near valleys, which are this blue line, and ridges, which are this red line. And so again, this is consistent with the fact that the bands are arced in the same direction as the contour lines, although they don't really follow the contour lines in these simulations. Okay, and so, but what we can do is now we can vary that the parameter that controls the what I'm calling the channel depth. So the relative elevation change going from valley to ridge. So for flat, when this parameter is 0, this is returns to the uniform hill slope, and we get these straight bands. And whenever it's small, we start to see this variation where these bands are arcing, along the direction of the contours, but they still remain a traveling wave and migrate uphill. And as we increase it further, we start to see actually different patterns appear within valleys and ridges. So in this case, we have more vegetation bands, like a smaller wavelength of the pattern inside the valley than on the ridge. And actually, if you watch simulations of these, the patterns move at different speeds. So you can kind of see, in this case, the pattern on the ridge actually moves faster. And so you can kind of see these really interesting patterns, spatio-temporal patterns, more complicated than just traveling wave patterns happening. And then as you keep going, you start to see uniform vegetation in the valley and bare soil on the ridge. Okay, so when it's really steep, the vegetation kind of starts to become uniform in the valley, bare on the ridge, and then the patterns form on the sidewall. So you get this kind of chevron pattern. Okay. So again, what I just described is in this kind of channel depth parameter and precipitation parameter, or water availability parameter, we've going along this direction where whenever the channel depth is relatively small, these ridges and valleys aren't so steep. We have patterns in both the ridges and valleys, but as we increase it, we start to see bare soil on the ridge and uniform vegetation in the valley. We can also change the relative precipitation, the water availability, and if we decrease it, what we start to see is the patterns tend to be confined to the valleys, and we have bare soil on the ridges. And if we increase the precipitation, we start to see the uniform vegetation in the valleys, and the patterns really are kind of stuck on the ridges. Okay, and we can sort of flesh out this picture in more detail with simulations. And what's being shown here is the blue is where we have large amplitude patterns in the valley, and the red is where we have large amplitude patterns on the ridge, and the purple is where we have both. Okay, so we have this nice picture in terms of the parameter space of where the patterns are relative to ridges and valleys. Let's see. Okay, well, let me just say a few more words about this picture, and then so what we're seeing is that the pattern in the valley, the region where it exists gets kind of shifted to lower and lower precipitation values, whereas the region where the pattern appears on the ridge gets shifted to higher and higher precipitation values as we get more and more curved ridges and valleys. Okay, and there's some, you can have some, there's a nice physical intuition about what's happening here. And it has to do with that accumulation term I was mentioning. So what's happening is that, remember, there's this kind of intermediate region where you can expect to see the patterns. And if it's too low, it's bare soil, and if it's too high, it's uniform vegetation. But as you start to to develop these valleys, the patterns in the valleys get water in addition, they sort of get more water because they're accumulating water that's coming from the ridges. And as you make the valley more and more steep, they're accumulating more effectively that water, right? And so what that means is they need less external water. So the region of where the patterns exist gets shifted to lower and lower A. Okay, so that's kind of what's happening here. And for these red regions, so the patterns on the ridges, kind of the opposite is happening. Because water is getting diverted away from these ridges, you actually need to input more water to support those patterns. So these regions get kind of shifted to higher and higher vegetation, higher and higher precipitation. Okay, and so that's kind of the intuition of what's happening here. But you'll notice that's not the full story, because it's not just that these regions are getting shifted. You can notice this red region is getting narrower as it's getting shifted up, and this blue region it seems like it might be getting a little wider. Okay. But what we can do is, with this intuition in mind, we can kind of analyze that picture in terms of a one-dimensional model, thinking about, like, if we were going to take a slice along a ridge or a valley. And what we can do is we can say that, well, along the ridge, we have an effective increase in this coefficient for this W term, this effective water loss. And that has to do with water getting diverted away. And then in valleys, we have an effective decrease in the water loss, and that has to do with water getting accumulated in. Okay, and so using this idea, we can compare those two-dimensional simulations to this one-dimensional model with an effective water loss rate, where if we're thinking about a valley, it shifts things down, and if we're thinking about a ridge, it shifts things up. And so this is kind of the predictions of that one-dimensional model, and overlaid over the two-dimensional model, it does, a pretty good job of lining up. So this is kind of enforces our idea that this is the underlying mechanism of what's happening here. Okay. And we can look at this also in more detailed models, and we see a similar picture. And so I guess I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes here, and then I'll wrap up, is that we have now this prediction, is that if you're on the lower end of the region where patterns are sustained by your ecosystem, then you tend to expect to see them in the valley. And that's, again, because there's not enough water, if there was flat terrain, but because you have these accumulation of water from the ridges, you can sort of make up for that deficit and support those patterns. And if you see a majority patterns on the ridges, you might expect that, well, this region is on the relatively higher range of the water availability scale, because in order for the patterns to appear, you need to actually divert water away from where the patterns are. Okay, and so this kind of suggests to us that there's information in where the pattern appears on the landscape, right? So if you're looking at a region and you see, oh, they tend to be patterns that tend to be on ridges, or and if they're on ridges, they tend to be arc convex downslope, then this region has a higher relative water availability to where the patterns can exist, right? And if it got less water available to them, then the patterns could just kind of migrate downhill and sort of follow the water. Whereas if they're already down in the valleys, then there's really nowhere for them to go. They're already at the place where there's the most water available to them. So this suggests to us if the patterns are on ridges, this ecosystem is maybe more resilient to drought or loss of increased aridity. And if they're in the valleys, it's kind of the opposite. They're really right at the edge. So it suggests to us that patterns on ridges is an indication of more resilience to drought. And so to study that, we looked at we started out in Australia, and we looked in North America and Africa. So North America, here we had higher water availability, and in Africa we had lower water availability. And so I mentioned this to you earlier. This is near that site where I showed you at the beginning. We tend to see the patterns mostly in valleys. And whereas if we look in this place in Texas, we tend to see the patterns mostly on ridges. And so this is sort of consistent with these predictions that I've talked to you about. And so let me just stop here. And so again, the idea, the underlying idea is that we can use these patterns along with models to kind of extract information about the ecosystem that supports them. And in this case, the thing that we learned is the placement of the patterns on the landscape relative to ridges and valleys can kind of give us some information about resilience. Okay, so let me stop there and see if there are any questions.
Let's all thank our speaker. Thank you very much. That was a very nice talk. Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Gandhi? I have one question about the extent of the formal analysis. You mentioned doing linear stability initially, and then to analyze the full nonlinear system, you switched to numerics. Does this system lend itself to kind of classic techniques, doing weakly nonlinear analysis, maybe derivation of amplitude equations, things like this?
Yeah, that's something we're working on now. I definitely think so. And I think so there's kind of this classic weakly nonlinear analysis we can do if we make certain assumptions. And some of the assumptions we're thinking about is if if the topographic variation is very small, we can kind of do things in that limit. And we can also, I think we might also be able to do things in the limit where we have a large aspect ratio, like thinking about these channels where the patterns are either confined to ridges or valleys, and thinking about the ratio of the domains. And there's also I'm going to go back here a little bit. I think we can also do some other weakly nonlinear analysis to actually, if we're not so interested in instead of the amplitude, we might be able to track the phase of these patterns. And I think that's something that might be more useful, especially in terms of looking at how that correlates with the data. So yes, I think definitely, and I think there's a few different ways.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Okay, in that case, let's thank our speaker again with our virtual claps. Yeah, thank you so much.